Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. My God, on a Sunday morning, thank you for coming. My name is Somnath Bhattabial, and I'm going to moderate this show with Ashish Da and Anitadi. I must first make a clarification. I think the only reason I am moderating this show is because I'm a Bengali. And like all Bengalis, no, really, like all Bengalis, we believe we know everything about Netaji. And in the last 5 days, when Ashish Da very kindly lent me his book, I realized I knew nothing. About a week back, I started to, when I got panicky about this session, I started to note down what I knew about Netaji. My first memory, I didn't grow up in Calcutta, I grew up in Assam. I'd gone to Calcutta, and my first memory, probably as a 5 or a 6-year-old, was somewhere in Esplanade. It was written, Netaji Phire Aschen. And there was a date given, I don't remember, and it was supposed to be in the Maidan. So I did kind of want to stay back in Calcutta wanting to meet Netaji. That didn't happen. That was the first memory I could think of. The second was more recent, in 2012. My father was unwell, and we knew that we didn't have very much time left with him, and I started to record his memories, the early childhood. I wanted to write something. And he told me about his time in Dhaka, where he was born and was living, and what kind of games they would play. So there was a neighbor next door, a girl, and my father said we would put on phantom-like dresses. I didn't know what that meant, but basically they would imagine themselves jumping from planes, being Netaji. So this was this kind of mythic figure that my father grew up with, passed on to me. Now my son knows about Netaji. And so Ashish, when we start, and I'll start with you, when we start talking about Netaji, the mystery and the mystery surrounding his death, it's the person also which lends to this mystery. You know, he escaped house arrest. The British put out rumors about his death. I don't think any other leader, however great they were, has this mystic, and perhaps that is why this mystery has persisted for 70 years, close to 70 years?
More than 70.
More than 70.
Yes, it's actually nearly 73 years,
73 years.
Since the unfortunate incident at Taipei on the 18th of August, 1945. But the mystique that you refer to really began from his childhood. Because as a child, well, in his teenage days, he left home for several months and disappeared in search of a guru. And then returned a few months later, and people were bewildered as to where he had gone. So it really began at that age. Then, of course, there was the dramatic escape from house arrest. He, dressed, indeed disguised as a Pathan, left Calcutta, hiding in a car, in the back of a car, and then reappearing a few months later in Berlin. Another incident has caused what I describe as a problem, which is this, that in 1942, the British put out a story to say that he had died in a plane crash in Tokyo. Now, this was incorrect information because he was sitting in Berlin at the time. So,
and the next day he sent out a broadcast, didn't he?
Indeed, he did a broadcast. As a matter of fact, Gandhiji sent a message to Netaji's mother, consoling her on his unfortunate end. But the fact is he was sitting in Berlin, and he did a broadcast from there the next day just to reassure people that he's very much alive and kicking. And so from there stems a suspicion that when the actual story of what happened in 1945 came out, people were suspicious, saying that, this must be one more story. And the other impression was that Subhas has this great gift of escaping. In fact, the British or the Americans were after him, and so he has possibly set this up, this plane crash, and slipped away into the Soviet Union. So that was really it. And so, to answer your question, yes, a series of incidents in his life have caused this mystique.
Thank you. Anita, if I may come to you, I'll ask the same question in a slightly different way. Ashish Da's book clearly lays out what happened. The actual event seems very cut and dried. You have been coming to India since 1960. State reception, the Teen Murti house, the first Prime Minister meeting you, and you've met successive government officials. But the mystery somehow doesn't get laid to rest. The outcome is always ambiguous. Why do you think this has happened?
I think there are a number of factors which contributed to that. First of all, in the beginning, and I'm not just talking about 1945, 1945 must have been a terrible upheaval. I was alive at the time, evidently, but don't have any active recollections. I lived in Austria at the time, and my first reminiscences go back to the Russian occupation or the Soviet occupation at the time. But still, it was a time of total upheaval, so it was not surprising that immediately there was nothing known. We also have to consider the means of transportation, the means of communication at the time. We had no cell phones where we took pictures of plane crashes and sent them across the world. By word, it sort of got around, and particularly if we consider the situation in Japan at the time, the Japanese were totally flabbergasted and come to a situation which they had never faced before. After the capitulation of Japan, they had heard their emperor on radio for the first time. He had never talked on the radio before to people. So it was a situation which was certainly very extraordinary. But after some time, let's see, 46, 47, there still was an exceptional situation, and certainly not one that we can compare today. There were immediate investigations into the incidents, of course. That was quite natural. But on the other hand, these were not put on Facebook or Instagram, but they were kept very secret and were classified for many years in some cases, or only open to a very limited audience. So in the beginning, we just did not know. And if I'm just thinking of two persons who were probably affected in the most personal and dramatic way, one was my mother, and the other one was my uncle, my father's second brother, Bose. Of course, they were totally shattered when they learned about his death. But then, in a way, what Ashish just mentioned, came the idea, well, he escaped in many different situations before. Maybe he managed it again. Maybe he's still alive. Maybe he went here or there. So at that time, we all did not know. And by the time when my uncle passed away in 1950, the situation was still rather unclear. And even though evidence had been presented to my uncle by a diplomat in Prague on what had happened, my uncle was totally shattered at the time, and my cousin, Dr. Shishir Bose, whose daughter is here today too, was present when this evidence was presented to him. And he said on the one hand it was quite convincing, and on the other hand he just couldn't face the idea of telling his father, accept it, but said, well, maybe it's not true, because my uncle was totally shattered. Yeah. And for my mother, it was partly also this hoping, and then when eventually my mother and my uncle got in touch, his attitude also sort of brought up her hope again. Right. So in the beginning, within the Bose family, at least, there was this hope, and also with many of the other freedom fighters, particularly, there certainly was a hope, except for those who had been present and sort of had immediate evidence. But people like mysteries. And my father was a very sort of romantic and tragic hero. And so somehow it's not so surprising that this kept on. Now, 30 years later, documents were released routinely, but not all of them. There were some who were kept under further lock and seal for, I think, 75 years or something. So people thought again, there's something fishy. What can that be? What could be in those documents that you don't release after 30 years? So it was very good that eventually the files were declassified. And many of us, like the two of us also, were not surprised that nothing by way of a mysterious or criminal activity on different persons, particularly, I mean, some had expected that Pandit Nehru had been involved in something. Yeah. And some of the ideas that people had were totally idiotic, really, because he was sitting in India at the time and certainly could not organize a plane crash in any way in 1945. So, I mean, but I mean, people were speculating, why are these documents under lock and seal? So it was good that it was declassified, and it turned out that all sorts of tiny factors came out, but nothing spectacular. But my father certainly lent himself to creating mysteries and ambiguities.
Absolutely, yeah. But Ashish's book does a very clinical explanation of what happened, who sat where, the plane itself, the place. And Ashita, would you want to show a quick slide to us to exactly see where Netaji was sitting, who were the others with him, for you guys, for you folks to understand? Yeah, Ashita?
Yeah, could we have the PowerPoint up, please? Let me begin by saying that my book brings together 11 different investigations, official and unofficial. 4 of them Indian, 3 of them British, 3 of them Japanese, and 1 Taiwanese investigation, because the crash took place, as you know, in Taiwan, in Taipei. So if we look at this, this is the plane on which he was traveling. It's a model of a Japanese bomber, which was called 97-2 Sally bomber. And this plane he actually got onto at Saigon. His final journey started on the 16th of August, 1945. From Singapore, he went to Bangkok, spent the night in Bangkok. 17th morning, he flew from Bangkok to Saigon. Now, at Saigon, he switched to this aircraft. And from there, they spent the night in Da Nang, also in Vietnam. And the following morning, the morning of the 18th of August, they flew, that is, Subhas Chandra Bose, his ADC, Colonel Habibur Rahman, and the rest of them, Japanese passengers and crew, flew from Da Nang to Taipei. Reached Taipei around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They took a sandwich break while the plane refueled, and as the plane was taking off, it then crashed. Now this is the aircraft here. If I point out, maybe, yeah, that's where the aircraft fell. So this is the runway. It goes down the length of the runway, and then having risen not very high, it falls within the perimeter of the airfield. That's the crash. But I'll come back to the aircraft itself, and here you can see as to where he was sitting. He was Subhas Chandra Bose was sitting here in the aircraft. These two were tanks carrying aviation fuel. So when the plane crashed, the fuel fell on his body, and he was completely drenched by fuel. And therefore, when through the fire, and the plane had caught fire, he tried to go out into the open, his entire body from head to foot was up in flames. And it was really the drenching from the fuel which caused this, because the others got away. Of course, there were some who died instantaneously inside the aircraft. But others who escaped, some of them died in hospital later on, and Subhas Bose was one of them. But ultimately, there were 6 survivors, 5 of them Japanese, and 1 Colonel Habibur Rahman. It is the first-hand eyewitness testimonies of these half a dozen people which cannot be denied. There's also the amazing technology the evidence of a person called Captain Nakamura. He was the ground engineer, and from ground level, standing on the tarmac, he saw the plane go up and fall. So his testimony also became very important. These were first-hand testimonies which, for some reason, people were not prepared to believe. And therefore, what I had to go through was this exercise of repeating these testimonies, because these testimonies were given at several points, starting with the first interim report that was prepared by the Japanese 28 days after the crash, and which was submitted to British authorities in September of 1945, and then we go on to several. And this, by the way, the diagram that you see is from the final Japanese investigation report, which was submitted in January 1956. And so, moving on from there, this is the hospital room, the treatment room, where Subhas Chandra Bose was treated. And this diagram was produced by one of 3 doctors who treated him, Dr. Suruta. Now, here is, sorry, lost it. Could I come back?
Could somebody have a look at the slides, please?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. So now, looking at this, this is the hospital room where he was treated. So this is the bed. He's lying on the bed. A diagram produced by Dr. Suruta. Suruta himself is there. Here is another person, the interpreter, also known as Nakamura, Juichi Nakamura, not the same person as the ground engineer, and who had in fact known Subhas Bose from the past, because whenever Bose visited Taipei, he would act as his interpreter. So he knew him from the past, so his evidence was also very, very important. And then here is Colonel Habibur Rahman, also at his bedside. And there's a military police guard there. But in actual fact, several people came in and out. In my estimate, anything between 4 to 8 people were in the hospital room, either there while he was being treated, after he had been critically wounded, or when he passed away. And this is a picture of a golden casket in Renkoji Temple, Tokyo, where his remains are kept. And these remains have been there from the 18th of September, 1945 onwards. I think it's about time India did something to bring the ashes to India.
Thank you, Ashita. Anita, to follow up on this, very precise details which Ashita has just shown us. There are 2 things I'd like to ask you. One, there is a political question, especially in Bengal, about accepting that 120 years later Netaji will not come back, and how to tell them this and make them accept this, including our chief minister. And the second question is, you've made some specific requests to the Indian government for closure, and you've said, let's have a DNA test. Do you think that, and given your long interaction with the Indian government again since the 60s, what do you think might happen now? What's the way forward?
Well, let me mention one fact. In 1995, 96, many of us thought that we had sort of come to a point where the Indian and the Japanese government would agree to bring the remains of Netaji back to India. The question was whether one should have some kind of memorial, not necessarily a building or a statue, but maybe an institution or something in his name and so on. And the two persons who were the two persons in government, I should say, who were very much in favor of that was the then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and the later Rashtrapatiji Pranab Mukherjee, who was foreign minister at the time. And in fact, Pranab Mukherjee came to visit my mother and me and my husband, my children, on his way back from the United States to discuss this. And he also mentioned that it's a very opportune situation. I'm, as a Bengali, I'm the foreign minister. Narasimha Rao is very much an admirer of Netaji, and I'm not telling you any secrets when I say not the entire Congress party has always been in the greatest of support of my father. So there were some misgivings on the part of some persons, but on the other hand, many Congress members were also great supporters of his. So anyway, it was felt that at that time one could sort of go ahead. The Japanese had been pressing for this transfer for a long time. But then the government changed. I don't recall now. It was some stupid thing we had re-elections. In any case, that was one problem. And the other problem which came about was some members of my family and some, I have to admit, great admirers of my father, who did not believe that he died in the plane crash, sort of banded together. I think they even had a march on Delhi or something to ask for another inquiry commission. So we felt first, well, inquiry commission would be probably done within a year and hand in the report. It was a new government now, of course, of the different party. And the point is, this inquiry commission worked for about 5 or 6 years and went around visiting places, talking to people, investigating things. And it looked as if they were not coming up with a report at all. But my situation in this case was I could not go ahead and press for a return of the remains while there was a government inquiry commission still at work. So we were really waiting for the report of this, what we call the Mukherjee Commission, because a judge by the name of Mukherjee was its sole member. Then, when the government once again changed, it was back to Congress government or Congress-led government. They pressed for handing in of the report. So the report was handed in somewhere in 2001, 2002. And all of a sudden, then, of course, we had this report. Now, the report came to a very strange conclusion. It had a number of questions. The questions are in Ashish's book, which they were to answer. And one of the questions referred to some of these stories going on about possible alternatives. And the Mukherjee Commission comes to the conclusion that all these do not make any sense, and he certainly was not an unknown Baba somewhere. And And also, no, there are some absolutely crazy and really insulting theories. I mean, if you think of a person with that record, to imagine that he would behave that way later on is...
And he was also supposed to have grown 2 meters taller.
Yeah.
I mean, Netaji could do many things, but actually the Baba was 2 meters taller. And they said, yes, that's possible. Netaji could do it.
Yeah, he could do anything. So he could also die and live.
Yeah.
Of course, my husband always says he does live because he lives in the hearts of his followers.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this it was very difficult to do anything about this. And with regard to the plane crash, the commission comes to a very funny conclusion. It says, well, he was in Taipei now, Taihoku then, on the 18th of August, but we don't know what happened to him. And one of the reasons why Judge Mukherjee comes to the conclusion is that he uses only written evidence. All the testimonials which Ashish mentioned, he ignores. Partly they also, Judge Mukherjee and people accompanying him also talked to some of the witnesses who were still alive, but these men were very old by then. For example, one of the doctors who treated him was well over 90 or thereabouts. And so you cannot imagine that a person at that age, after, when I was 60 odd years, would still have that clearer recollection of what happened. And even if there were some sort of confused statements, I think most of us will not live to be 90, leave alone be lucid enough to make clear statements. So it was very odd that he just ignored the testimonials and came to his conclusion. And recently, somebody who again went over the report very carefully, and a man who is very astute and used to dealing with facts and analyzing them, called me up and said, look here, this report is incoherent. It says something in the text, but if you go back to the documents that it refers to, the documents don't say what he says in the text. So in a way, this is rather was a rather confusing report. But in any case, the people who believed that he did not die in 1945 sort of had a new hope that this would sort of further the situation. I'm getting too long-winded, but let me get to this one thing, why the government has not been doing anything, which was a bit odd, because the government did not accept this report. On the other hand, you might say, but if they don't accept the report, they would do the opposite and say, well, he died in the plane crash, and we can go ahead with doing something about bringing back the remains. But they didn't do that either. And I think it's partly that politicians have always been hedging, because politicians have to and will look at what helps me or what harms me. And since there were different views on my father's death, they always felt, if we very clearly state one thing or the other, we'll antagonize some of our potential electorate. So the government was quite happy sort of to hedge.
Carry on.
And particularly since in the Bose family there were different opinions, and some were very clearly in favor of keeping him alive forever.
When you mention politicians in India, one of the things about Netaji's legacy is that perhaps he was never seen as a politician per se, though he was the Congress president twice. There's just something about selflessness, about giving it up, about his struggle, being a revolutionary until the end, which there's this mystique about Netaji. But there's another very problematic side, which most Bengalis do not want to deal with, and you have mentioned this in the book, his sometimes very overt support for the governments of the time in Germany and in Austria. He's written texts on the possible merging of the communist movement and the fascist movement, and we have ignored it, as Bengalis do. Would you want to, both of you, talk about this part of Netaji and how one reconciles with the larger picture of the man?
I've dealt with it in the sense, as you have read the book, you know, in what is a biographical sketch of his life, which is chapter 1. And in that, I build up for people who may not know much about Subhas Bose, especially people who may be foreigners, to understand who this person was. And his philosophy, because he was absolutely adamant about gaining freedom for India, and therefore his philosophy was that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and therefore he was prepared to collaborate and seek the support of Axis powers to achieve his goal of freedom for India. And that is where, in hindsight, of course, it can be said that it was controversial, and history has turned out to be one where obviously the Allies won the war, and therefore, as inevitably happens, the victorious side dictates interpretation of events. But having said that, I don't think anybody would say that he supported any of the unsavory elements of Germany at that period of time, or Japan at that period of time. He had a single-minded approach, and that was quite simply the freedom of India. It started with his resignation here in this country. He came here as a student because his father wanted him to appear for the Indian civil service examinations, a very, very coveted service in those days. So he came to England, he did his graduation at Cambridge, and he appeared for the ICS. He actually felt that he didn't have much of a chance, because normally people took 2 years to prepare for the ICS examinations, or took in those days. He had only about 8 or 9 months before the examinations were coming
even
up.
his college was quite interrupted because of his radical activities.
Yes, and of course, he had this single-minded, yes, in India, as you know. He, as a student leader, he was rusticated from Presidency College, perhaps singled out in that situation, because there was no absolute evidence that he had done any physical harm to the professor concerned. But because he was considered to be the leader of a group, they rusticated him from Presidency College. He then came back to Scottish Church College, finished his graduation in India, came to England, finished his studies at Cambridge, appeared for the ICS. In fact, his results were brilliant in the ICS. It included coming first in English language. And then, of course, he had no intention of serving the Raj. And so he resigned. In this very city, he sent a letter to the Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, saying that I do not wish to take up the commission. And he returned to India, got off the boat in Mumbai, within hours met Mahatma Gandhi, and after that long conversation with the then leader of the Indian freedom movement, he was advised to go to his home city of Calcutta, where Chittaranjan Das was the leader of the Congress and became Subhas's political guru. So from that teenage stage onwards, it's been one of sacrifice. There's no question about it. And for him, the freedom of India, self-respect for India, was of utmost importance.
Thank you, Ashita. You've answered this.
Short additions to that. I quite agree with what Ashish said. Keep in mind that the options to turn to support from any other country was very limited. Certainly, Britain was the enemy. And the allies of Britain were no possible supporters. I mean, you might have said, well, the United States was once a colony too. They might support a colonial, but they were on the side of Britain. So and the World War II situation sort of formed different camps. So he could only turn to the enemy of his enemy, which was not a very positive selection that was available. But he had this single-mindedness of purpose all the time. And just to sort of put this in perspective, I think you may say people have a single goal. My father certainly did. But I think anyone sort of has priorities. And if you look at the other Indian leaders, you find decisions that were made which were maybe not as difficult to understand, like siding with a fascist regime, but which in the context of the Indian freedom struggle was also somewhat surprising. You could say that part of the Congress leadership of those days, during the beginning of the Second World War, was collaborating or contemplating collaboration with Britain. Because they said, well, let's support the British activities in the Second World War, and then we will gain independence, or let Britain promise us independence after that. I think for a person with my father's frame of mind, that was almost traitorous, this kind of attitude, even though he was always a great admirer of Gandhi. Even when he was abroad or when he was in India, was always looking to what is he saying. And in spite of the fact that
the Congress presidency and all of this.
One has to admit that Gandhi has not been dealing with him in a very friendly way, let's put it that way.
One thing, I mean, I'll ask for a few more stories. You know, and again, Ashish Da's book mentions it. Much has been made of the apparent rift with, I mean, Gandhiji we know, but also with Nehru, though they were on the same leftist camp in the Congress, but there have been letters exchanged, again, mentioned in your book. You went and met Pandit Nehru in 1960. There was a grand reception. How, any conversations, any reminiscences about what the relationship between these two great men were?
I must say, first of all, Pandit Nehru was personally very friendly towards my mother when he met her, which was only once, and towards me, which was, well, you might say twice. I stayed with him for a week during my first visit in India. I don't recall that we really talked about his relationship with my father. I was still quite young, but I was quite aware that there had been a strained kind of relationship between the two. But as you mentioned, in a way they were of the same camp. But my father, being very single-minded, would not compromise, even if Gandhi said so. Whereas ultimately, when it came down to decide, Nehru would. And of course, there might have been another aspect. Nehru might have been more inclined also towards this anti-fascist attitude, which Gandhi did take. But I think one cannot only look at them as sort of enemies as such. I mean, they were brothers in arms, so to say, on the one hand, but they went different ways when it came to deciding how do we go about it in a very difficult situation. And if one looks at the letters which were exchanged, my father was rather bitter about the fact that Nehru did not support him in his exchange with Gandhi. Now, some people speculate that Nehru also did this for certain selfish reasons because it was opportune to be in the good books of Gandhi. I don't know whether that is true. But I can only say that towards me personally, when we met, he was friendly, gracious, and but I don't recall talking about old times with him.
But again, Ashish Das' book will bring out the letters and the exchanges, quite significantly emotional exchanges which Netaji has with Panditji. And on that note, let me show you the book and ask Anitadi to inaugurate it. Anitadi, this is Ashish Das' book, Laid to Rest.
Here you have the photo,
Yeah.
and in the book, I think, let's see,
Yeah.
there are some other photos, but of course, these are too small for you to see.
Yeah, those of you who couldn't see on the screen there, they're all here.
Any number of old photos, black and white, and some of them a bit blurred and not so clear. One is a very well-known one with Hitler. But I have to mention that this is not a sign of great sympathy, and in fact, this one meeting with Hitler was a great disappointment for my father.
Yeah.
The only outcome for him was that Hitler agreed to support him in getting back to the Far East, which of course was important.
Yeah. And the submarine was
but it was quite clear that Hitler did not accede to his request that Germany would commit herself to supporting India's independence after the Second World War.
And could I just add that the photo on the cover is the last photo of Subhas Bose. It was taken about 24 hours before the crash. It was in Saigon. He is disembarking in Saigon, where he spent a few hours during the day. And that's the last available. Last available. We thought that it would fit best on the cover.
Can I open up to audience questions? Yeah, just before I do that, and I'll ask you to. Again, going back to my Bengali roots, I did call up my mother to say, "Ma, do you know whom I'm meeting?" So she dropped the phone first, did a bit of a scream, and then asked me to ask a question to you, Anitadi.
Very good that you obey your mother.
Yes. Again, being Bengali sons, there's no other way. So I'll garb this in a bit of a sociological question rather than how exactly my mom put it. The legacy of being Netaji's daughter. And you've been coming back to Kolkata, you've been coming back to India. What is it to grow up with this huge weight, the halo, history, politics? My mother's question was simpler.
Okay.
But
I grew up, for the most part, outside India. I grew up in Austria till I was 22, then got married, moved to the United States, and in 71, between 71 and 74, it sort of kept changing, and I moved to Germany. I've lived there since. And I think I owe it to my mother that the legacy was not too difficult, because my mother always conveyed one thing, said, your father was a great man, but that doesn't make you great anything. If anything, it is a commitment and an obligation to be decent and to try to contribute something positive. And I think she tried to educate me more in the sense of being humble and not I'm important because he's so and since I lived outside India and at least in Austria and Germany, my father was when I was young, his name was still somewhat known to older people, but nowadays it's not at all known really. Very few who sort of studied this part of history. Whereas in Japan, his name is still a household word, so to say, and his role in the Second World War is very much in the history books. I may quote Dr. Lakshmi Sehgal and Colonel Dillon, Colonel Dillon and Mr. Sehgal, Colonel Sehgal where two of the persons tried at the Red Fort, as probably most of you know. And Dr. Lakshmi Sehgal later got married to him, and she was the commander-in-chief of the Rani of Jhansi Corps of the Indian National Army. And these two visited our house around the time of my father's 100th birthday. And my father asked them, "Do you think Anita should have gone to India?" And they said, "No, that it was much better that she stayed away, because I was not forced into a role, say, like Indira Gandhi or Rajiv or the children of many other politicians, to sort of carry on and in a way give up their own life, because this is the other side. It may be glory and opportunity and advantage, but in essence you also sort of give up your own life and your own opportunities, however small they might be, without that heritage. So I can say what I did in my life, I did more or less not because of my father, but I might have reached greater heights if I had sort of carried on as his daughter in India. In fact, some people say, "Well, you have to come to India, go into politics." And once I made a joking remark to one gentleman, I said, "But I'm much too smart for that."
You refuse dynastic politics. That's not very common in India. The floor is open, friends. The gentleman there.
Can I ask both of you to comment about the meeting between Subhas Chandra Bose and Hitler? I know a version which was written in a book called The Good German, Adam von Trott zu Solz. Is there any more to be said about that? Thank you.
Anita, you first.
Okay. One comment to Adam von Trott zu Solz is, for those who don't know it, Adam von Trott zu Solz had a very important position in the Foreign Office in Germany and was sort of the liaison person for my father. But as it turned out, he was also in a very specific opposition to Hitler. He was one of the officers who was executed in 1944 for trying to assassinate Hitler. So it's always a bit open to speculation what his position was. He certainly was a more cosmopolitan, open person than many of the others in the leadership. Now, what he wrote had to be written before 1944, so evidently you could not write whatever you liked at the time. So I must say I have not read Adam von Trott zu Solz's report, but from what I know from my mother and also from others who wrote about it, it took a very long time. If one person, incidentally, who has a very dry kind of book is a German scholar who wrote about my father and the Axis powers. That was Jan Kuhlmann. And he tried for a long time to get that appointment with Hitler, because it was clear that some of the decisions in favor of India to pass this India resolution about which I was talking could only be done with Hitler's okay. Surprisingly enough, my father got support from some very staunch Nazis, like Heinrich Himmler, for example. But for many of them, it was sort of a difficult situation, because on the one hand, they had a racist doctrine in their mind. On the other hand, some were quite supportive of him personally. Maybe that partly goes back to the fact that Germany also has a history, as you know, Shomnath, of Indian studies and dealing with Indian culture. But it definitely was very difficult to get to see Hitler altogether. And eventually that was possible. And my father tried to also confront him on the points of a racist policy he had written in his book on Mein Kampf. but Hitler made it quite clear that he was not going to support India. In fact, sort of intimated that India was better off under British rule. And so this was a great disappointment, and also sort of convinced my father that it was better to turn to the Far East, where it seemed more likely. See, his interest in Germany had been possibly to sort of be involved in a military campaign from northern Africa or via Turkey and Iran and so on, to have a military attack with German support on India. But when the African campaign of General Rommel failed, that was evidently out of the question. So there was, even though there existed an Indian Legion in Germany, and my father had also made sure that the soldiers of the Indian Legion, partly German, partly Indians, who had sworn an oath of allegiance both to Hitler and to my father, he had made sure that they would not be sent to the Eastern Front fighting the Soviet Union, but only to fight the British. That was lucky for them, because the Eastern Front certainly was not a very pleasant place to be. Think of Stalingrad, where many, I don't know how many soldiers on both sides died. But that way the Indian Legion really had played no military role, because they were sort of in a waiting position. Whereas in the Far East, the options at that time became more positive, and so from that point of view, it was good that he got the opportunity to go to the Far East, which also was not very easy, because at that time this was a forbidding journey anyway, and have this journey in a submarine in the middle of a war certainly was a difficult thing. But the Hitler meeting was a disappointment.
I concur, absolutely. Just to very briefly say this, that I, in my book, have gone by the records of the German government, the minutes of the meeting. It was obviously a fractious meeting. They agreed on very little. Subhas Bose was writing to the German government from the 1930s, objecting to its racist policies. In fact, children in places like Munich used to call Indians neggers, meaning niggers. And that was objectionable. Bose took it up with the German government because a lot of Indian students in Germany complained to him about this. And then, of course, there was this fundamental disagreement that Bose was seeking support from Germany, Italy, and Japan, a statement of support for the independence of India, which Italy and Japan agreed to. Even Ribbentrop, the foreign minister of Germany, was sympathetic, but Hitler shot it down. So it was a non-meeting, really. And a Bengali friend of Subhas Bose asked him, what did you think of him? And he replied in Bengali, he said, Boddho Pagol. And it means, raving mad, raving mad. Yeah.
So there you go. That lays the controversy to rest. I'll have one right at the back. Yes.
The mic is right here.
I don't think we have much time.
Thank you. Very quickly, thank you for a fascinating session. What is your view on the appropriation of Subhas Bose and his legacy by the current government in India, whose politics is completely contrary to the secular, progressive politics of Subhas Bose?
Thank you. Our session, Salil, but quickly.
Well, obviously, you're talking about the extreme right trying to appropriate a person who belonged to the left. It doesn't work, because even if you say there's a common thread of nationalism, I personally do not accept that the right wing are nationalists. On the contrary, I would say that they are anti-India, because the moment you see India as a community then you are dividing India. And that, I think, is anti-India. India has to be seen as an Indian, not as a Hindu Indian or a Muslim Indian or a Christian Indian, only as an Indian.
Thank you, Ashish. Amitaji, yeah, let's have the concluding remarks on this particular point which Salil has just brought up. How is it possible that the right can appropriate Netaji?
It's not that surprising if you think of people, irrespective of their political leaning as politicians. And I'm not criticizing them. They are in a special situation, and so they have to also get support of things. But I also want to say in their favor, irrespective of what a policy of the party as such might be, there certainly are very genuine supporters and admirers of Netaji in the BJP, in the Congress Party, in the Communist Party for that matter. And on the other hand, you might say, even though the Forward Bloc, now almost non-entity, used to be my father's party, I think there are some who certainly have not always dealt in his spirit.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Sorry, I just... Okay, quick.